a black waitress begged a billionaire, "Sir, please marry me, my uncle wants to marry me off to his cruel." What happens when a woman, desperate to escape a cruel fate, pleads with a billionaire to save her? And what if the billionaire, in saving her, discovers that their families have been bound by secrets, lies, and betrayals for years? Cara Daniels was no stranger to struggle. At 27, her life was a delicate balancing act, serving plates of $200 lobster thermidor to Chicago's elite while scraping together every penny to pay for her mother's cancer treatments. Her hands, calloused from years of waitressing, moved with practiced grace as she navigated the opulent dining room of Lucille. Her warm brown skin glistened under the chandelier light, and her tight curls were pulled back into a neat bun, but her eyes, deep, soulful and tired, betrayed the weight she carried. Cara grew up in Englewood, a neighborhood where dreams were often deferred, but her mother, Marla, had instilled in her a fierce determination. Marla, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, was Cara's anchor. Now, with Marla's stage 4 breast cancer draining their savings, Cara worked 14-hour shifts, her body aching but her spirit unyielding. She had no time for romance, no space for dreams beyond survival. But survival, she was learning, came at a cost. It was a Tuesday night, the restaurant buzzing with Chicago's power players, when her estranged uncle, Leon Carter, walked through the doors. Cara hadn't seen him in over a decade, not since he'd left her and Marla to fend for themselves after her father's death. Leon was a hulking figure, his tailored suit doing little to hide the menace in his posture. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Cara as she approached his table. "Cara," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something dark. "We need to talk." Her stomach churned. She forced a smile, the kind she'd perfected for difficult customers. "What's this about, Uncle Leon?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's about your mother's bills. I can take care of them. All of them. But there's a price." Cara's heart sank. She knew Leon, his wealth came from shady deals, his generosity always a transaction. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the dread creeping up her spine. "Marry Thomas Bennett," he said, his eyes glinting. "My business partner. He's taken a liking to you." Cara's tray nearly slipped from her hands. Thomas Bennett was a name she'd heard in hushed, fearful tones. A real estate mogul with a reputation for cruelty, he was known to destroy anyone who crossed him. The idea of being tied to him made her skin crawl. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leon's smile was cold. "Then your mother's treatments stop. You can't afford them, Cara. You know that." The world tilted. Cara excused herself, her legs shaking as she retreated to the kitchen. She leaned against the wall, gasping for air, her mind racing. She couldn't marry Thomas. She wouldn't. But her mother's life hung in the balance. There had to be another way. The next night, Cara was back at Lucille, her mind still reeling from Leon's ultimatum. The restaurant was packed, the air thick with the clink of glasses and the hum of conversation. She moved through the crowd, her smile a mask, when she noticed a man sitting alone at a corner table. He was striking, tall, with sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes that seemed to see through the chaos of the room. His tailored suit screamed wealth, but there was something different about him, a quiet intensity that set him apart from the usual clientele. "Evening, sir," Cara said, setting a glass of water on his table. "Can I get you anything else?" He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers. "Just a moment of your time," he said, his voice low and warm. "You seem like you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Cara blinked, caught off guard. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just another night." He tilted his head, studying her. "I'm Alexander Kingsley," he said, extending a hand. "And you don't seem fine." Cara hesitated but shook his hand, her skin tingling at the contact. Alexander Kingsley, the billionaire philanthropist whose name was plastered across Chicago's charity galas and tech startups. She'd read about him, a self-made man who'd risen from nothing, a rarity in a world of inherited wealth. But there was something else about him, something haunted in his eyes that mirrored her own. They talked briefly, his questions gentle but probing. Kara found herself opening up, just a little, about the long hours, the endless grind. He listened, really listened, and for the first time in months, she felt seen. But the moment was fleeting. Another table called for her, and she excused herself, her heart pounding. Alexander Kingsley was a stranger, a fleeting distraction. She couldn't afford distractions, not when her mother's life was on the line. 2 days later, Kara's world was crumbling. Leon had sent her a contract, a chillingly formal document outlining her engagement to Thomas Bennett. The terms were clear: marry Thomas, and Marla's medical bills would be paid in full. Refuse, and Leon would pull the plug on her mother's care. Kara sat in the hospital, holding Marla's frail hand, her mind spiraling. Marla, weak but still sharp, noticed her daughter's distress. "What's wrong, baby?" Marla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kara forced a smile. "Nothing, Mama. Just tired." But the lie felt hollow. She couldn't tell her mother the truth. Not yet. Not when Marla was fighting for every breath. That night, back at Lucille, Kara was a wreck. Her hands shook as she poured wine, her mind consumed by the contract burning a hole in her bag. Thomas Bennett himself was dining at the restaurant, his cold eyes tracking her every move. She felt like prey, cornered and helpless. Then she saw him, Alexander Kingsley, back at his corner table, his gaze steady and reassuring. Something snapped in her. She couldn't do this alone. She couldn't marry Thomas. In a moment of sheer desperation, she approached Alexander's table, her voice trembling. "Sir," she whispered, leaning close so no one else could hear. "Please. I need your help. Marry me." Alexander's eyes widened, his fork pausing mid-air. "What?" Kara's voice cracked as she poured out her story. Leon's ultimatum, Thomas's cruelty, her mother's illness. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held his gaze, her pride and fear warring within her. "I know it sounds insane, but I'm trapped. You're my only way out." Alexander set down his fork, his expression unreadable. "You don't even know me," he said softly. "I know you're not like them," she said, her voice fierce. "Please. I'm begging you." He studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. But this isn't a fairy tale, Kara. If we do this, it's a business arrangement. I'll keep you safe, but don't expect more." Kara nodded, relief flooding her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in a small courthouse with only a clerk and a witness. Kara wore a simple white dress, her hands trembling as she signed the papers. Alexander stood beside her, his presence steady but distant. He'd agreed to the marriage, wiring funds to cover Marla's treatments within hours, but he'd made it clear, this was a transaction, not a romance. Still, as they left the courthouse, Kara couldn't help but notice the way Alexander's hand lingered on her arm, steadying her as they stepped into the rain. There was something in his touch, something that felt like more than obligation. They moved into Alexander's penthouse, a sleek, modern space that felt worlds away from Kara's cramped apartment. He gave her a room of her own, insisting on boundaries. But as the days turned into weeks, Kara began to see cracks in Alexander's polished exterior. Late at night, she'd catch him staring out at the city, his expression haunted. He spoke little of his past, but she sensed a weight there, a darkness that mirrored her own. Meanwhile, Leon was furious. He showed up at Lucille, his face a mask of rage. "You think you've outsmarted me?" he hissed, cornering Kara in the alley behind the restaurant. "Thomas will destroy you both." Kara stood her ground, her voice steady. "I'm not your pawn, Leon. Not anymore." But Leon's words lingered, a chilling reminder that she wasn't free yet. Thomas was still out there, and his shadow loomed large. As Kara and Alexander settled into their uneasy alliance, they began to uncover secrets that tied their lives together in ways neither could have imagined. Alexander, curious about Leon's hold over Kara, hired a private investigator. The findings were staggering. Leon and Thomas weren't just business partners, they were entangled in a web of criminal dealings, from money laundering to extortion. And Kara's family was at the center of it. One night, as they pored over the investigators' files, Alexander revealed a piece of his own past. "My father was like Thomas," he said, his voice low. "A man who used power to control everyone around him. I swore I'd never be like him." Kara reached for his hand, her heart aching. "You're not," she said softly. "You're here, helping me." Their eyes met, and for the first time, the walls between them seemed to crumble. Alexander leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. But before anything could happen, the investigator called with a bombshell. Thomas Bennett was Kara's biological father. Kara reeled, the revelation shattering everything she thought she knew. Her mother had lied to her for years, hiding the truth about her father. Worse, Marla had known about Leon's plan to marry her off to Thomas, believing it was the only way to keep Kara safe from his wrath. Kara confronted Marla at the hospital, her voice trembling with betrayal. "How could you keep this from me?" she demanded. Marla's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to protect you," she whispered. "Thomas is a monster, but he's powerful. I thought it was the only way." Kara stormed out, her world in pieces. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Not her mother, not Leon, not even herself. The truth about Thomas set off a chain reaction. Leon, desperate to maintain his hold over Thomas, escalated his threats, vowing to ruin Alexander's empire if Kara didn't comply. Thomas, meanwhile, grew more unhinged, his obsession with Kara intensifying. He cornered her at Lucille, his eyes wild with rage. "You think you can escape me?" he snarled, grabbing her wrist. "You're mine, Kara. You've always been mine." Before Kara could respond, Alexander appeared, his presence a wall of quiet strength. "Let her go," he said, his voice deadly calm. Thomas laughed, but there was fear in his eyes. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Kingsley." "I know exactly who you are," Alexander said, stepping closer. "And I know what you've done." The confrontation ended with Thomas retreating, but the danger was far from over. Alexander and Kara devised a plan, exposed Thomas and Leon's criminal empire. With the investigators' evidence and Alexander's resources, they leaked the files to the authorities, triggering a federal investigation. But the night before the story broke, Thomas made one last move. He kidnapped Marla from the hospital, sending Kara a message: surrender, or her mother would die. Kara was ready to give herself up, but Alexander stopped her. "We do this together," he said, his voice fierce. "You're not alone anymore." They tracked Thomas to an abandoned warehouse, where a tense standoff unfolded. Thomas, unhinged and desperate, held a gun to Marla's head. Kara's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "You're not my father," she said, her voice steady. "You're just a man who's lost everything." Alexander moved swiftly, disarming Thomas with a skill that spoke of a past he'd never shared. The police arrived, and Thomas and Leon were arrested, their empire crumbling. With Thomas and Leon behind bars, Kara and Marla were finally free. But the scars of betrayal lingered. Kara struggled to forgive her mother, but in time, they began to rebuild their relationship, piece by piece. Alexander, too, was changed. He'd spent years running from his past, but Kara's courage had shown him what it meant to face it. Their marriage, born of necessity, had grown into something real. One night, as they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city glittering below, Alexander took her hand. "I didn't believe in love," he said, his voice soft. "Not until you." Kara smiled, her heart full. "I didn't either," she admitted. "But you showed me it's worth fighting for." They kissed, the city fading away, their bond forged in fire and unbreakable. Kara had survived, not just for her mother, but for herself. And in Alexander, she'd found a partner who saw her not as a victim, but as a warrior. A year later, Kara stood in a small community center in Englewood, now funded by Alexander's foundation. She'd left Lucille to start a nonprofit, helping women escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. Marla, in remission, stood beside her, her pride evident. Alexander joined them, his arm around Kara's waist. "You did this," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "We did this," she corrected, leaning into him. The center buzzed with life, laughter, hope, and the promise of new beginnings. Kara looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling. She'd been through hell, but she'd come out stronger. And with Alexander by her side, she knew she could face anything.